Holy moly! Good job getting this far in the course. You should really be proud of yourself because we've learned a lot. And now we're going to build something really exciting. We're going to build a startup landing page. A landing page like this that, well, is responsive, but most importantly, it has some text, it has a button, but check this out. When you click on the button, it takes you to a form to sign up and collect email addresses. That's right, we're building a startup landing page. I'm going to show you how to do it step by step, and you can grab the starter files attached to this lesson because we're going to build this from scratch and see how we can put something online that you can now share with your friends next time you have a big startup idea. Let's get started. Welcome back. So how are we going to build this from scratch based on what we've learned so far? Well, we're going to use Bootstrap for this because we just learned it. And I actually gave you some starter files attached to the last lesson. If we take a look, that's right, we had a header image, we had an index HTML file, and then a style.css file. So you can open these, make sure they're all in the same folder. I called mine startup with an exclamation mark because this is an exciting project. And in our case, we'll use Sublime Text. We should have something like this. So we have our index.html file, our style.css, and then our header image. Now I filled in a few things for you just to get us started. Nothing too crazy though, don't worry. One is we've used some Google fonts so that we can use this Montserrat font, which I think is kind of nice from the Google fonts. And we enable that in our style sheet by saying body and HTML. I want to make sure that the font family has this setting. If not, we'll use sans serif. I've also set width and height for 100%. That's always something good to have to make sure that the body and HTML cover 100% of whatever we see on the screen. Next, we have our Bootstrap CSS from a CDN, or a content delivery network. And the reason I've added this here is that so you don't have to actually include a Bootstrap file yourself. If I actually go to the Bootstrap page and I go to Quick Start, you'll see that right here, we can just copy and paste this, just like here, with the Bootstrap CSS file. So that way, right away, as soon as we copy and paste this line, we have Bootstrap available to us. Now, notice here how we have versions of Bootstrap. In this case, it's 4.3.1. Now, this number, as the time passes, is going to get bigger and bigger because Bootstrap is a constantly evolving library as developers make updates. But as long as you use a number higher than this, everything in this project should work. Like I said, most of the time, no matter when you're watching this video, as long as you copy this or you use my starter files, everything should work. And then finally, we have our style sheet. Nothing new here, right? Because we've already seen this before. We have our style.css file, and our style file just has this for now. We also have our header image, which again is a nice little laptop image for our startup landing page. Now, this is the website over here that is completely blank because we have nothing in the body. So let's just have a header one that says hello right here. Save it and refresh. Look at that. We have hello. Now, notice here how fast I did that. I just pressed Command R on my laptop, which is a Mac. If you have Windows, it's Control R to refresh the web page. And you notice here that the font is being applied once again because we have our font family CSS set. So there's our page, our setup. And there is what we want to get to. Now, if you want, you can go off on your own and try to attempt to build this from scratch yourself. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video to actually get our page to look a little bit more like this and less like this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. All right, let's get going here. Now, the first thing we want to do is change this hello to, Well, the biggest startup event of the year. Very dramatic, I know. So let's do that. I'm just going to say the biggest startup event of the year. That's right. Okay, let's save. So I'm doing Command S, or if you're on Windows, Control S. And then refresh, Command R, or if you're on Windows, Control R. All right, there we go. That's great. We also seem to have a button that says Find Out More. So let's do that as well. We'll say button, Find Out More. There we go. If I refresh here, there you go. Our startup landing page is, well, frankly, still looking fairly ugly. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to have this background image. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about how we can set up our HTML page so that we have good responsive design. So right now, nothing much is going on. You can see here that I can adjust the screen size, but we don't have much happening on our page. So if we go back to the Bootstrap documentation, in the Quick Start Guide, if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you see that I get a starter template here. And you might notice here something that we haven't seen before, which is this part over here, called a required meta tag. And you can see here that this is actually something that we can copy and paste and place right below our title here, just like that. Now, let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see. And I'll make the writing smaller just so you can see over here exactly what's happening. So this meta tag allows us to add new information to our HTML page. And there's different things that we can provide. Now, in most websites, you'll actually see these two lines very often. As a matter of fact, it's recommended that you always add them. Now, what exactly do they do? Well, if we scroll down here, you'll see that we have the responsive meta tag. Essentially, this line here, which says viewport, allows us to create web pages that are developed mobile first. That is, we let the page know, or the browser know, that this page should work on mobile devices, and things like scrolling or touching or zooming on a mobile device is going to work with this tag. Now, this is something I'm going to leave for you to learn more about, and it's something we'll talk about later in the course. But these meta tags are just useful things to add to our projects anytime we create a new page. And then finally, this top meta tag uses UTF-8 encoding. Essentially, it's saying, hey, we're going to use this form of encoding to write text on our pages. Again, something that if you're curious, you can read up on your own. But now that we've set this up so that it's good for mobile as well, let's try to include this background image into our page. Now, when it comes to background images on a website, that's a very common thing. You'll see a lot of people adding background images to a website, or maybe patterns or some sort of colors. And when a common problem happens, I always like, well, Googling. And one of the first things that you'll encounter is this perfect full page background image by CSS Tricks, which we've seen before. Now, if you scroll all the way down, it tells us a way for us to make sure that we use the image in a full page background so that it stretches, it flexes as the viewport changes. Now, over here, it actually gives us a copy and paste way that we can use it ourselves. So I'm going to just copy this, go to my style page, and just add this to our CSS. Now you'll see over here that we're using background over here with the URL. So we want to adjust it to header.jpg because that's the URL of the header. And the key here is these lines. It's saying, hey, we don't want to repeat the image. We want you to keep it centered, and we want you to keep it fixed. And by using this line, it stretches, or at least it fills the entire page with our image. And as long as we have background size as cover, well, let's see what happens. I'm going to refresh. Hey, and look at that. Now I have this image that adapts to our page. But the cool part is if I open the developer tools here, let's say View, Developer Tools, you'll notice that the image actually bumps up so that the center of the image, well, is always centered. How cool is that? So this is a very useful trick to have your background very flexible. All right, so we have our background. Unfortunately, our writing right now is hard to see. The button's still kind of ugly. So let's fix a few things in our HTML page. Now remember, we have Bootstrap, so we can start using some Bootstrap classes now. One thing that I want to do is with this h1 tag, I want to maybe use a strong element to emphasize the header. So make sure we close this, and I'm going to make this bigger just so you can see. And if I refresh, all right, that's emphasized a little bit more. We also want to make sure that this h1 tag we can actually see. So we can go into our style and just create a new h1 style that will have, let's say, a font size of, let's say, 3 rem. And then we'll give it a color of, what should we do here? Well, one thing that I always like to do when I'm trying to figure out what color I want is to go to a page, let's say like the startup over here, open up the developer tools, make sure this is a little bit bigger so we can see, and then find somewhere on the page where you have this color palette. If I actually click on this and I'm on Chrome, look at that. It opens up a little color palette for us. So I can actually move around things and grab the hex of the color that I want. In our case, I want the color to be, well, let's find out. How can I copy the color of this page? I can just click on select an element, this little icon here. And then if I hover over this, look at that. It shows me exactly what color this element has. You can see over here that this is the hex color. So I'm just going to copy that, come back, and paste it in. Now if I save both of these files and refresh, that's much better. I like that a lot. All right, we're making progress with our page. It's getting closer, but we still have a lot to do. So let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, everybody, let's keep going. What else can we do to this page to make it look more like this one? Well, I want the text uppercase here. You can see over here that this is all in capitals, this is not. I mean, I could change this if I want to capital letters. I can also add a style to make everything uppercase. But there's also another useful one that comes with Bootstrap. I can actually add a class and use a class in Bootstrap called text-uppercase. If I save this and refresh, look at that. Everything is uppercased. That's awesome. Now, what about the button? Let's add some Bootstrap styling to the buttons. Again, let's say you don't know how to add Bootstrap styles or you don't know the classes. We can always go to the documentation and search buttons. There we go. We see that we have some button classes that we can use. In our case, let's use this one, button primary. So I'm going to copy, come back, and with this button, let's give it a class of button primary. If I save and refresh, hey, look at that. We have a Bootstrap button already. That's really, really cool. But you know what? I want to have a different color, right? I want the button to look more like this, something nicer. So we can add our own custom CSS. Let's call this class button XL for extra large button. And this isn't a Bootstrap class. If I save this and refresh, nothing will happen. Instead, we can create this button XL right here in our own style sheet. So let's say button or .button XL is going to be, let's make this a little bit bigger, is going to have padding of, let's say, 1 REM on the sides and 2 REM top bottom. If I refresh this, that's better. That's a lot bigger. So we have an extra large button. Now we can add sizes or we can add different properties here. But since we named this class button XL, we should just leave it the way it's describing things. That is to make the button larger. So instead, let's just modify the existing classes that we have, which is the button and button primary. So if I go back here, we can say that the button class will have a font weight of, let's say, 700 and a border radius, that is to make the edges more circular, and we'll give it 300 pixels. If I save this and refresh, that's a lot better. I like that. And I want this capitalized as well, and I could use the text uppercase class as we've seen before, or I can just in here say text transform and just say uppercase. So just use a CSS class. If I refresh, that looks really, really nice. Now let's keep going here. Let's add another class here, which is button primary. So we're just adding on to the Bootstrap styles that we have. And we'll just give it a background color of, what should we do? Well, if we go back to this page, again, we inspect right here by hovering, and we click. We see over here as we scroll down what color we're using over here. Let's see. Where's the color? Let's see. Oh, there it is right here. So I'm going to copy the color, add it here. If I hit save and refresh, hey, look at that. That's really, really nice. But one thing you'll notice is that the border over here, if we scroll or zoom in, you see that the border has a bit of blue, and that's default for the Bootstrap theme. So instead, let's add a border as well. So I'll call it border color and give it the same color. If I refresh, that's much better. Although now we're hovering and it's turning blue. That's okay, but I don't like it. Let's make it hover so it's still orange, but maybe a little bit darker orange. So what can we do here? Again, we've seen this before. We can just say button primary colon hover. And in here, we can just add background color to be something a little bit different than this. In this case, we're going to use a color that is EE4B08. Don't worry, I didn't memorize this. This is just something that, well, I knew that I used when I made this website first. So don't worry, you never need to memorize hex colors. Next, we'll do the same for the border color. So once again, we'll make the border color the same as we have here. That's great. I also want to increase the border width, actually, to just make it a little bit bigger when we hover over it. So let's just give it an extra 4 pixels, and let's save. If I refresh and hover, hey, look at that. That's awesome. So that's looking really, really nice. So we have the button. It's looking pretty good. We have our header. That's looking pretty great as well. The other thing I want to add is this little line here, just to give it a little extra flair to the page. And we can use something called an HR here, or a horizontal line. So the HR tag, which we can just put in between, so let's say HR, is a horizontal line. So if I refresh here, I don't know if you can see it, well, because it's dark, but let's add some styling to it. So let's say in here that we want the HRs on our page to have a border color of the orange that we've had before, which is this one over here. So let's say border color is this. If I save and refresh, all right, look at that. There's our little line. It's a little thin though, so let's add a bit of sizing. So I'll say border width and give it, let's say 3 pixels. And if I refresh, all right, that's getting bigger, that's good. But I don't want this to be the entire page. I only want it a little bit, just like we see it here. So we have a CSS property here that we can use called max width, which, as the name suggests, tells us exactly what's the maximum width of this thing. In our case, let's say 65 pixels. So if I save this and refresh, that's much better. All right, we're making progress here, but there's an issue, right? Right now we have the content that we want, but it's all over the place. It's kind of ugly, isn't it? We want everything centered, maybe around this laptop over here. And this is where Bootstrap really shines. So let's figure that out in the next video. All right, it's time to talk about layout. Now, we already learned how layout works in Bootstrap, and we talked about why Bootstrap became so popular. Now, don't worry, later on in the course, I'm going to introduce you to topics like CSS Grid and actually talk about really easy ways to do layout on a page. But for now, we want us to use Bootstrap because that's what we learned. And I'm warning you, this is going to seem very overwhelming. I want to show you how Bootstrap does layout because down the road, when I introduce you to things like CSS Grid, you're going to see how much easier we have it now than we had maybe a few years ago. But I still want you to learn how layout is done in Bootstrap because you will encounter it throughout your career. Now, if you go to the layout section on the Bootstrap documentation, you see over here that it has some pretty good information. We can look at the grids, and we've already talked about how grid works with Bootstrap. Now, the first thing we want to do is to have a container and then maybe some rows that we can use columns on. So if we go back to our page and we open up the index.html file, the first thing I want to do around the body, and one thing I'll do with my Sublime text here is actually minimize the head tag here just so we can see a little bit. So I'm going to just click on this and look at that. It's minimized so I can just focus on the body. The first thing I want to do is say that I want to create a div with a class of container. Just like that. And then we'll close this right over here. So let's indent that properly. Let's save and refresh. All right, we have everything in a container. Next is that we want, ideally, all of these things to be in a row. So we want the H1, the HR, and the button to just be a row, one row that we have that is in the center of the page. So I'm just going to wrap this in a div and give it a class of row. So once again, let's close the div and indent this again. If I refresh, not much has changed. We may have lost the HR. We'll get back to that in a second, but we have a row now. So that if I inspect, let's say View, Developer Tools, and I click on this Inspect, I see, well, these elements. If I go over here and let's open this up, make this a little bit smaller, we see that we have the body, we have the div, which is the container, and then we have the row right here. All right, let me close this. Let's divide up these items into different sections. We have the header element that we can use, and this header element will contain the H1 over here. So we have the header. And one thing that we can use with Bootstrap is a class called text center. And text center, as you might guess, if I refresh, centers the text. So that's great. That's our header element. And we also want to create another section here. Let's call it section. So this is a section element. And this section element will also have the class text center. So if I refresh, there you go. We got our HR horizontal line back. And why isn't this centered? Let's inspect this and find out. So I can open Developer Tools by pressing Command Option I or Control Option I if you're on a Windows. And let's look at the elements. We have the container, we have the row, we have the header, and then we have the section. Now, we see over here that these ones aren't taking up the full width as we would want of the container. And we've seen this before with Bootstrap, right? We have to use this columns to tell it, hey, we want to contain or expand along the column. And because Bootstrap uses a 12 grid system, we can just say in here in that the header, we want the column 12 grid. And then for the section, we want the column 12 grid. So if I refresh, there you go, look at that. If I go over here, I see that we have the row, we have the header, and then we have the text, which as you can see contains the full amount of the container in the blue. That's looking a lot better. That's great. Now if I close this, our text and button, it's still at the top. Ideally, it's in the middle of the image. How can we fix this? Now, this part is really, really tricky. If I actually search vertical alignment here, you'll see that Bootstrap has some vertical alignment options, but these ones are using inline, inline block, inline table, which is actually not the recommended way. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to use flex. And this is a new feature with Bootstrap because they're using the Flexbox utilities that we've learned about, right? So if I go over here, you can see that I can activate the Flexbox system by using the dflex class. So if I copy this and go to container and say dflex, if I refresh, all right, nothing happened because we've just enabled Flexbox. But now we want to make sure that we can place things vertically in the center. And this, if we scroll down, is what we want right here. Align items. If we look over here, it's align items center. So if I copy this, which is this one over here, and we add align items center, if I refresh, this isn't working. And this is a little tricky. And I'm showing you this just to understand how to debug things. So let's say you just did this and for some reason, you don't understand why this isn't working. On the documentation page, clearly, it shows us that this should be working. Well, we can inspect, so let's right-click, inspect, and have a look at our HTML page. We have the container and then the body. Now you see here how everything is in the container. And as a matter of fact, if we look at the container, we're actually aligning items in the center because the container is actually not the full page. It's only the top part, right? It's just this part. So here, the container is not fully covering the page. So what we need to do, just like we have in body, if we look at style here, you see how we have height of 100%? all we need to do is tell the container that, hey, I want you to span the entire height of the page. And in Bootstrap, we can do that by saying height 100 instead of adding the CSS style. If I save this and refresh, look at that. If I hover, you'll see that my container is now the full length of the page. And our writing is right in the middle. If I scroll up or down, look at that. It's adjusting properly. Everything is centered. That's great. Now, don't worry if this takes you a long time to figure out. Sometimes it involves Googling around, figure things out. Like I said, later on in the CSS layout section of the course, I'll actually show you how to make this so much simpler. Now, the last thing I want to do is, well, right here. I want to have a bit of space between the writing and the button. So what can we do here? I want another section in between these two to hopefully buffer them away from each other. So we can create that fairly easily. We can just add a new div and we'll give it a class here of buffer that we'll have to write ourselves. And this buffer class will be in between the header and then the horizontal line and the button. So let's also give this a column of 12 because we want to make sure that it covers the entire area. But right now, there's nothing. If I right click here and inspect, you'll see here that I have the buffer, but the buffer doesn't have anything. It's completely empty because, well, there's nothing inside here. But we can add a style, let's say .buffer. And this buffer will have a height of, what should we say? Well, if I do, let's say 50 pixels and I refresh, look at that. I get a nice little buffer. So now if I scroll over to buffer, you see that I have a 50 pixel height buffer. But I always like using REM instead of pixels. So let's do REM. Let's see what 5 REM means. All right, that's good. Maybe a little bit more. Let's do 10 REM. Let's save and refresh. All right, that looks actually quite nice. If I close this tab, open it up. Yeah, look at that. That looks really, really nice. And there we go. We have our startup landing page right here. Everything looks pretty nice, right? And the way we've organized things seems pretty clean. Our button is, well, when we hover, available, but whenever I click on this button, nothing's happening. Ideally, we have a new page that opens up so that we can enter, or our customers can enter their emails. And this is the exciting part that we're going to get to in the next video. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.